Ethereum hasn't actually reached product market fit, right? Most transactions, you don't actually want them be fully transparent. I do not
Exactly.
want my payroll to be fully public. I do not want where I spend with my credit card to be fully public. No one wants that.
Aztec is doing something new and from certain points of view can look crazy, but that's what makes it super exciting to me.
We raised over $60 million in ETH from more than 16,000 people. I want a meaningful portion of economic activity of the world to be happening on Ethereum specifically. We'll deserve to get the praise when we hit 30, maybe 40% of economic activity facilitated through these platforms.
Welcome back to a new episode of Uncut Gems, where we host the most exciting and disruptive emerging crypto projects. Today, I have the pleasure to be joined by Marco, who is leading protocol expansion at Bitcoin Suisse. Together, we are going to have a conversation with Arnaud Schenk, co-founder of Aztec and executive director at the Aztec Foundation. Welcome, Arnaud.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome.
Hi.
Hey, Marco. Nice to have you here as well. For the audience, first of all, if you didn't hear anything about Aztec, you should know that we're going to talk about privacy. And in any case, you should know that we are not talking about a new project. Like normally at Uncut Gems, maybe we talk about new projects that just started or they're really up and coming. Aztec is doing privacy since a very long time. They're not coming out of nowhere. That's what I want to say. And after a long history, like years of research on zero-knowledge technology and open contributions also for other projects, providing building blocks on privacy solutions, they are now getting ready to deliver a true private world computer. And that's what is really exciting to me. Because privacy now is a very hot topic. There are all kinds of projects that are trying to provide privacy solutions to blockchain, which is not obvious. They're doing it in very different ways. But I promise nobody is doing it like Aztec. Aztec is doing something new and from certain points of view can look crazy, like fully decentralized stage 2 roll up at launch. But that's what makes it super exciting to me. I have the pleasure now to have Arnaud with us to explain what is happening and what is coming soon. But before we start talking about Aztec, could you give us an introduction on your background? How did you even start working in crypto? What's your history?
Yeah, so I left school quite young. I left school at about 16, and after a couple of years of not really knowing what I was up to, I'd always been in these subcultures of jailbreaking, or yeah, these subcultures of, I don't want to say hacking. It wasn't hacking. It was just having fun with computers in ways that maybe would have scared a few people. I didn't have that in mind as a potential career. That just felt like fun, like a hobby to me. Not when I thought career in computers, I thought IT, and I definitely didn't want to do that. But after leaving school and after spending a few years in the wilderness, I realized that there were these things called startups. And so kind of gravitated towards this world. At the time, it felt like it was emerging, although, of course, it was a long-standing industry. But everything to do with tech startups and Silicon Valley really drew me in. I've always been in early stage companies in one way or another. For crypto, I guess you can imagine being in that field, being in tech, being raised online. You encounter Bitcoin and you encounter Ethereum quite early on. I actually was decently skeptical of Bitcoin in the very early days. It felt to me not quite real enough, not quite tangible enough. I remember reading about the Ethereum ICO, and although it still felt a little bit too pie in the sky when I first encountered it, as I thought about it more, there's something about Ethereum as this resurgence or this kind of reigniting of how I experienced the internet growing up, right? The internet as a place where net new things were happening that was very distinct as a place to the real world, right? That it was very much like people used to call it cyberspace. I guess I found that frontier that had kind of disappeared from view during the 2010s. I found it again in Ethereum, and that's really what drew me in over time, is just this idea of you have a place where very ambitious people are taking very seriously the idea of cyberspace and creating new institutions, creating new technologies, having a jurisdiction which is for the first time actually adapted to the world post-internet. That really captured my imagination.
I get it. And yeah, I think I can relate. I also like the idea of these open contributions and also the fact that I asked you about background, but one of the good things in the early Ethereum and maybe still today in certain aspects of crypto is background really doesn't matter too much. It matters like anyone from everywhere in the world can contribute to an open permissionless system
That's the
independently
idea.
of credentials, reputation, and background anonymously. Yeah, it's also resonated with me. It's definitely super fascinating. Thank you for this introduction. And yeah, maybe we are now ready to move more towards
Let's
Aztec.
talk about Aztec. Let's talk about privacy. You correctly say that we've been working on this for a long time. We started in 2017, so in crypto times, it is a long time. When I describe Aztec and the path we've taken, I think one of the common misunderstandings is because we do quite complex cryptography and because we do quite complex technical things, a common misunderstanding is assuming that we've just been working on this kind of ideologically in our own little dark corner, removed from the world in this almost monk-like fashion. And some people, I think that idea is quite appealing, but that's just not the DNA of the organization. We actually started off not wanting to do privacy at all. We saw Ethereum as a place to build a company in traditional finance, really, or at the intersection of traditional finance and crypto. In trying to build that, we came to the realization that the transparency of these traditional systems, of Ethereum as a traditional system at this point, 10 years on, was just not, it just didn't allow us to build what we wanted to build. If everything had to be fully transparent, fully public all the time, the company we wanted to build in 2017 just couldn't happen. And yeah, I always describe us as reluctant cryptographers in a deep way. We always wanted to build the smallest amount of cryptography we could get away with to try and solve that problem that we encountered back then. And we've shipped quite a few things to production where we've shipped last year and are still building on now. That is something that represents to me like the platform or the tools that we wish we had in 2017, but it took us quite a few iteration steps to get it right. I always thought we needed less than what we ended up having to build.
I agree, and I get it. And I want to make it clear, we are not talking here about a solution in search of a problem. It's a typical thing that sometimes people say about crypto projects that are unnecessarily complicated or trying to get decentralization just for the sake of decentralization. This
Mm.
is different. Like we have real value proposition here coming from experience of trying to provide real value to the world. So
Mm.
yeah, let's go deeper into
Yeah,
this. Maybe Marco, you want?
you had
Yeah.
mentioned, Arno, that you left school quite early. You went to school in Lausanne, so did Wolfgang, but unfortunately you didn't end up here. But
Because
luckily you
that's
started Aztec. Talking about value proposition, the space this year is really growing up. We see the convergence with TradFi. So for us, it would be great to understand, why did you start Aztec and why
Mm.
do we need Aztec on Ethereum and in the crypto space?
So we, in 2017, what brought us together as we ended up being four co-founders, one of whom came from a traditional finance background. So he worked in this field in finance called syndicated loans, private debt, corporate debt. He was very active or very deep in kind of mid-market syndicated loans. So quite large loans, tens of millions to maybe low hundreds of millions. And it's an industry at the time, still today, it hasn't changed much, unfortunately, which is, it's a bit weird because there's private debt funds that have to compete and collaborate to issue these big loans, these chunky loans. And these loans can last quite a while, right? They can last years or decades for some. And they all operated on these fax, paper, word of mouth systems, right? Like, there was a few SaaS products that had started being adopted at the time, and that has diffused a little bit, but it's still very much manual reconciliation, big back offices, just a lot of things where even back then, the idea of having a single source of truth, of having an asset which is on this neutral layer, right? Like, it's not issued on a platform that you have to think about having like some kind of counterparty risk to as the issuer. It's just out there in the world, on the internet, in cyberspace, issued in this jurisdiction. And on top of that, it's programmable. You can combine it in various ways. You can have governance rules encoded in the asset itself. All of those selling points, which, I mean, that is what Ethereum was really built to support. That felt really attractive to us. And when we went to market in the syndicated loan industry with a proof of concept, just a very basic issuance and trading platform, We gave them that pitch. We didn't talk about Ethereum, we didn't talk about crypto, we just talked about the benefits of this platform. That was very resonant as well, up until the point where we started talking about the transparency that Ethereum imposes, right? The idea of these traditional financial institutions revealing everything, not only about the loans, but the trades, the terms that they're giving to this customer, but not that customer, the portfolio makeup of these different debt funds couldn't happen, right? That was a no-go. And we thought that other people would solve this problem for us. We thought that it was going to be obvious to everyone involved that the promises that are made in, for example, the 2014 Ethereum white paper, you can't really build autonomous or digital first organizations. You can't really do complex asset issuance. You can't do payments if you don't have an alternative to this radical transparency. When we looked around in 2017, early 2018, we realized that the only people doing privacy really were, at the time, Monero and Zcash, and they were oriented not at all towards programmability, right? They were not oriented towards making this flexible, easy to use, cheap to use. They were wrangling quite complex cryptography, but it just didn't serve our purpose. We wanted to give developers as much flexibility as Ethereum gave them, but also with the control of revealing particular bits of information, particular transactions to particular people, having a sense of like not everyone in the world has access to this at all times. And that's when we decided that if we wanted to ship this product, we were excited about, we just kind of had to do this detour. We thought it was going to be a 6-month detour into cryptography. 8 years on, it was more complicated than we thought. But yeah, that was the origin story. This felt need, this market demand for the products that Ethereum enables, market demand for Ethereum with more control, more ability to say, I want the single source of truth asset, I want the programmable asset, but I also want to say it is an asset that not the whole world can look into at all times.
So, yeah, all right. To summarize, is it fair to say that a unique value proposition here can be summarized in just 2 words: programmable privacy, programmable and composable privacy, and you can go deeper into it. And programmability here, from my understanding, means that privacy is more flexible. It's not all or nothing. You can have some parts of the state and or the computation that are public, some others that are not, and this is good for compliance with regulations. You can do more useful applications that are compliant with regulations, or you can do fully private, up to you. But programmable also means, in a way, more useful or more use cases than just value transfers. Because if the only use case was value transfer, that's pretty much solved. That's what programmability gives you, and that's what Aztec is building. So that's really cool.
You can imagine everything. There's some complexities that come from dealing with encrypted state. I'll just put it this way. Everything that you can do on Ethereum, everything that you might want to do on Ethereum, you need programmability, right? That's the unique aspect, the idea of I want this asset, but I want this asset to have to behave in a particular way on particular conditions, or I want particular people to have particular rights in this particular asset. To take a non-financial example, I want an identity gate, right? I want some kind of gate to my protocol or to my app, which can only be passed by people who are able to prove to me that they're from a particular country, have a particular history on a website, or have a particular token. All of that is programmability. All of that is the idea for the ability for a developer to set rules in a way that is very flexible, very well. Back in the day, we used to make a big deal out of Turing completeness. You have complete flexibility on how you design your apps. In the cryptography space, being able to wrangle encrypted states and make apps that to the outside world reveal nothing about what you're doing, but still give the developer really easy programmability, really like flexible use of this encrypted state. That's something that over the last 10 years has become practical. The very basic cryptography of, let's say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, outside of some research labs, was really you can have a binary encrypted, not encrypted. And if something is encrypted, you can't do anything with that data until you decrypt it. Or maybe like signatures and hashing, but obviously that's not privacy preserving. Whereas now with these zero-knowledge proofs, technically you still, me on my computer, in order to kind of run a program, I'm still decrypting the data in some way, right? But out in the world, the only thing that gets posted to the blockchain is completely encrypted data. And yet everyone who sees that data, like a counterparty, for example, in a transfer, knows that the only way that I could have sent them that transfer to the outside world, they don't even know that a transfer has happened. But me as the recipient, I know that you pass through this particular logic in order to get me this money, right? Like we can go into how this all works with zero-knowledge proofs and the layers that we have to build on top of the cryptography to make this really easy to use for developers. But fundamentally, what we've built is a very flexible way to build with encrypted state and to build within systems that make use of encrypted state.
I think it's fascinating, actually quite cool that back in 2017, you and your co-founders actually had in mind creating a product that can also be used for institutions, while the space in the last few years was not really catering to those. That led you to doing, well, the way into privacy where you thought you can do it in like 8 months. And, well, obviously it was a bit harder than that. So as I understand, it led you to create an L2 with its own programmable language.
Mhm.
And it would be great if you could
Step through the
elaborate
history.
and
Yeah.
also maybe how the Aztec blockchain that is based on ZK differs from an account-based ledger like Ethereum, where the day-to-day user sees transactions from address X to address Y.
Yeah.
And how does a ledger on Aztec look like?
Cool. So I'll take a brief detour on the history and then I'll give a very quick intro on Aztec. In 2018 is when we had this realization that no one else was going to come save us. We had to build the cryptography, we had to build the privacy that we thought we needed. And we started off, because none of us were cryptographers, we started off with what is, in retrospect, incredibly simple cryptography. My co-founder, Zach, with important help from Jens Groth, who you might know from Groth 16, who even back then was a very just well-established cryptographer. He was very kind and gave us a lot of time. Back then, we had a very basic, it was Sigma protocols and Bonoboyan signatures, just very basic cryptography that meant that on Ethereum mainnet, you could have confidential transfers. It's very similar in both structure and kind of end product to what Solana is doing nowadays. It's basically the idea of you still see who is transacting, you still see what assets are being transacted, but you just have transactions of encrypted amounts. And we thought that was all we needed to do these syndicated loans in a confidential way. Unfortunately, that was still very difficult for developers to use, even for us that had invented the technology. It was a lot of hand assembling bytecode in order to make this cryptography efficient enough. Because it was all on Ethereum mainnet, it was also still expensive. It was cheaper than any alternative, but it's still too expensive to be practical. During 2019, the realization cemented in the team that we needed more flexibility, we needed something more powerful, we needed something that was more approaching snarks. Snarks have been established for a long time, zero knowledge snarks, right? So my co-founder Zach with Ariel Gabson, who used to be at Zcash and is now the Aztec chief scientist, during 2019 formulated what we now call Plonk. And Plonk is the first really efficient zero-knowledge proof ZK snark. And it's still, or ideas in that Plonk paper still underpin quite a lot of the kind of cryptography, both in scaling and in privacy that you see in blockchain today. Plonk allowed us to also do recursion, and that meant that we could suddenly do these, we didn't call them roll-up, we didn't call them layer twos at the time, but over the course of 2019, 2020, we realized that we could do this, what is now is ZK rollup, as in you have privacy that is off-chain, and then you aggregate a bunch of transactions and you post the results on-chain. And that means you batch these private transactions in a way that give you a bunch of efficiency gains and costs, well, it just costs much less than if you have to do everything on Ethereum. We shipped quite a few products, always iterating on the cryptography, but based on this kind of Plonk basis. ZK Money, we shipped payments with the privacy of Zcash on top of Ethereum. We called that Aztec Connect, and that shipped in maybe 2022 or maybe, 2021 or 2022. Both of those products did about $500 million worth of volume over their lifespan. But again and again, what we realized was this was taking us every iteration a year and a half to ship. This was a lot still of hand wrangling bytecode. Objectively, we couldn't have shipped the product that we wanted to ship in 2017 on top of these systems. They were just too inflexible, too centralized, too fragile for us to ship a product that was going to go out into the world and potentially host hundreds of billions or trillions of assets. So in 2023, we decided, let's go general. Let's actually solve all these hard problems that we've been avoiding. Let's make it easily programmable for non-cryptographers. Let's make it decentralized from day one. Let's make it permissionless and trustless. And let's just actually do it. And that's really what we've shipped over the course of last year and early this year. I said I'd keep it short. On how Aztec works, the way I like to talk about this is to talk about the difference with a system like Ethereum, right? On Ethereum, which I'm assuming most of your audience is familiar with, if I want to do a transfer, what I'm doing on my computer is creating a little package of information, a little package of instructions that I'm then going to send to all of the Ethereum network, all of the sequencers on Ethereum. But me as the user, I'm not actually doing the computation. I may choose to do a simulation on my machine, but I'm not changing the data myself. I'm asking others to do all these instructions and to change the data that ends up represented on Ethereum. That imposes a couple of constraints that I think have blocked Ethereum from getting to the world. The first one is something that you can shift over time with scaling. You have to really constrain how much computation each one of these nodes does. So computation on Ethereum has always been incredibly limited because all of these nodes have to redo it every time. You need both the computation and the data to be fully public, right? You need every node that potentially joins the network long in the future to be able to see, like, this was the state before, and this is the states that I'm going to, and this is the code that's being run. Everything has to be fully transparent. What zero-knowledge proofs in general give you the ability to do, most ZK rollups out there in the world are not privacy related at all. What Aztec does, we actually use zero-knowledge proofs at two stages, at two layers. The first is on my computer, on Aztec, I run the computation myself when I'm doing privacy preserving things. I actually modify the data, I run the smart contracts, I do everything that needs to be done on my computer. And then I prove using zero-knowledge proofs that I've done everything correctly. And then I send that package of data to sequencers on the Aztec network. They gather transactions by users and run a snark over those transactions and basically just condense the batch of transactions that they have aggregated. They prove that all those transactions together fit the rules of the network and post that proof to Ethereum, which means gas cost savings and is a more efficient way to do it. Ethereum, on the flip side, verifies that everyone in this chain has done everything correctly. There's no one that's tried to lie or do something bad, even though a lot of that data is completely opaque to Ethereum sequencers. They just can't look into this encrypted data. So that to me is the special sauce, right? Client-side proving, which means that I can use data that is fully private. I can have smart contracts. I can have things developed by external developers that make use of my private data. But because I'm doing all the computation on my machine, I can do that computation in a way that never reveals, even to this outside observer, that data is never revealed to anyone else. And the complexity, maybe the last one about Aztec, is obviously not everything should be fully private. We have both private and public states. You have the ability in a single transaction to do private and public things. But fundamentally, the big difference between Aztec and something like Ethereum is this, like, where the computation happens and the fact that given it happens on my local computer, I can use private data, I can use private information, even though I'm transacting with strangers. They have all the guarantees of a traditional blockchain. They know that I'm not lying to them and I'm not minting things blindly. I'm not using code that they don't know what it does. I'm not revealing any more information than I strictly need to.
Thank you for the deep dive. At this point, there are many directions where we can go. Either more details on Aztec solution, but also comparison with other solutions. And maybe I want to touch first on that because, as you said, back then, when you started approaching this problem, there was not much else, and you had to build it yourself. Over the years, and I think mostly recently, there are more and more options and more projects that are trying. We will go into the nuances, and the nuances are important, but they will also say we are building a private world computer or we are building private general purpose compute, anything but private. I want to know if there are some trade-offs here, that there are some solutions that make sense. Like, for instance, I know you work with Tasio, co-snarks, snarks plus MPC is a good solution, right? In principle. And fully homomorphic encryption plus MPC can also work. Some people go the other side, trusted execution environments. I say we have decentralized TE network. We offer private compute. So I want to know from your point of view, which solutions make sense to compare if there are clear trade-offs that led you to go your direction or still believe it's the right direction for your purpose. Yeah. If we can have a comparison here among solutions that make sense.
Yeah. I said earlier that we're reluctant cryptographers in many ways. What I mean by that is we're not ideological about the cryptography that we write or how we write it. We have a very concrete set of goals for the technology that we build. If that means using cryptography that is not invented within Aztec or using a mix of things like T's and MPC and ZK to achieve our goals, there's no friction at all within Aztec to do that. And you said it yourself, we work very closely with Tazio. And Tazio, just as a brief introduction for the audience, zero knowledge proofs, ZK, they are really great for doing things where it is my private data and maybe some public data. But if, for example, me and Marco want to do some kind of computation together, but I don't want Marco to know what my private data is, and Marco doesn't want me to know what his private data is, this kind of computing over intersections or combinations of private data, ZK is just not very good at that. That is not what it's built for. And something that is really good at that is multiparty computation. That's literally what it's for. And multiparty computation is the idea of we can all decide to run some kind of computation together as a group and get some outputs together based on the inputs we share without any one of us knowing each other's inputs. We still get this common output, this common computation. So let's be concrete about this. There's this toy example that often gets talked about around invoice reconciliation, right? The idea of if we're a bunch of companies together that all trade roughly within the same network and we all are sending in each other invoices, it's actually really inefficient for us all to have to pay each other all the time instead of just netting out all these invoices and only paying the differences where they occur. If I'm company A and Marco's company B, Wolfgang is company C, we need to know all of the invoices that have been shared between us. If you do it partially, I can't on my own say I'm only going to pay Marco this much based on the invoices that I know about. But simultaneously, I don't want everyone to know how much I'm paying everyone that I'm paying, right? Like that doesn't work. What multi-party compute does, especially if it's wrapped in zero-knowledge proofs for validity and for kind of to make sure that you can then use it in a system like Aztec, we can all send our data in a secret shared way to either each other or to a third-party MPC network. That multi-party computation network, none of the nodes individually can figure out what any of our data is, right? It's all encrypted within the system. But together, they can compute a single zero-knowledge proof that is basically saying, I've run this netting algorithm correctly. In fact, we'll be able to verify if we post this zero-knowledge proof on a blockchain. And maybe that you have a smart contract on Aztec that once that zero-knowledge proof is validated, kind of distributes or kind of nets out our balances automatically. I can figure out that I've not been cheated. I know exactly that everything has been done correctly, but I still don't know how much you and Marco have been paying your suppliers. And I think that's quite cool, right? That's a cool combination of these technologies that you only get if you combine, for example, ZK and MPC. If you only use ZK, you don't really have an opportunity to build something like this. To get back to your actual question, what other solutions make sense? From my perspective, things like T's, things like MPC, things like ZK, they all have a place, but they also all have trade-offs, right? Like there's all compromises. We don't take the view that ZK is this like technology sent from God that is the answer to everything. ZK has very special properties that we think is essential to build privacy-preserving programmable apps in the context of blockchains. But even in our ecosystem, we see people combining T's and ZK and MPC and ZK. FHE, I think, is still a little bit further away from being useful in this context for reasons that I can get into. But yeah, combinations of technologies more so than any single kind of panacea.
Makes sense. Thanks. One last thing about Aztec technical implementation. You touched on client-side proving, necessary to keep at least some part of your data private. It never leaves your device, but it also means you will need to do the proving. So I'm wondering what this means for hardware requirements. Can we use any Aztec app from my mobile phone? How
Yeah,
is latency? Considering also you need to, eventually you want to have finality on Ethereum. So there will be
yeah,
proving also from the prover network to update the state of the rollup and so on. Now I use
yeah,
CK Passport, so I know I can use my phone. It
yeah.
works. But are there maybe more complex applications that require more compute time? How do you, yeah, what's
So
the,
this is another thing where I think it's very hard for external folks to see, but we're on fully custom cryptography. We've been building this up from the ground up, iteratively shipping things, realizing the trade-offs from performance, security, and memory use, just a bunch of trade-offs you have to keep in mind when building these systems. And we have, at this point, I think it's still fair to say, the most performant client-side proving out there. But, a simple transfer on Aztec will take a couple, less than 10 seconds to prove, usually less than five. That is on kind of average hardware. For finality, that's a little bit more like a deeper topic because we have a couple of states that your kind of transaction can be in. If I just do a simple transfer to you on Aztec, right now we have a live network that just has gas set to 0, but on Alpha with user transactions enabled, it'll be within the same kind of order of magnitude as Ethereum. So in about 10, 12 seconds, you'll get confirmation that there's been a block that has been mined that includes your transactions on the Aztec blockchain. Then, as you put it, it then eventually needs to end up on Ethereum. It's worth saying while you are on just the Aztec
yeah,
blockchain on this unproven block, your data has been posted to Ethereum for one thing, and also you benefit from the security of all of the stake of Aztec sequencers. So it's worth quite a lot already. The proof that it cements your state on Ethereum can take between 5 and 10 minutes to generate. Essentially, your transaction goes from generate the proof in 10, 12 seconds, you end up on the Aztec blockchain, and then that gets posted to Ethereum. If it's larger transfers and you care a lot about the outcome never being reverted, maybe you'll wait a minute or two for everything, sorry, a minute or two kind of post the proof being on Ethereum, but it's all within the expectations that you have on modern blockchains.
yeah, I think the Ethereum finality time for sure matters if you want to exit or when you want to exit or if you need to send
Yeah,
messages to L1 and so on. But otherwise, the guarantees that you have from the Aztec network of the validators and sequencers is enough. So
yeah,
yeah,
indeed.
thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah,
And
I have a TradFi background, of course, as a Swiss person. That's my first branch of where I worked. And if I may do some analogies, Ethereum like solved the settlement problem. I think the world is running on ledgers. Every bank is a siloed ledger.
Mhm.
And at the end of the day, all the banks have to do checks. If the transactions that happened were correct, there is reconciliation and whatnot. So we check with our ledger, with the other bank's ledger and whatnot. And Ethereum, well, is the global ledger and everyone has the same copy. So in finance terms, it solved settlement. And what Aztec is solving is the private execution.
Mm.
Because in TradFi, if I send money, I trust the bank that they handle my data privately. But on Ethereum, this was public, right? If I send someone money and the recipient usually doesn't know how much money is on my bank account, and this is in Ethereum is the case. On the execution side, as I understand, Aztec is solving the privacy problem. And if we talked about finality, if you also compare it with TradFi, trades take usually 2 days to settle in TradFi. So a few block times on Ethereum, I think we can live with that. For
I,
me,
I,
yeah,
I,
go
I
on.
I will say this is why we're doing what we're doing. Ethereum hasn't actually reached product market fit. You say it solved settlement, but it hasn't in practice. It solved settlements in an abstract way, but it hasn't in
Yes,
practice because most transactions that happen in the world, you don't actually want, or for most of them, you actually can't have them be fully transparent. I do not
exactly.
want my payroll to be fully public. I do not want where I spend with my credit card to be fully public. If I'm doing cap table management on my company, I wouldn't want that to be fully public. No one wants that. Ethereum has introduced a few very interesting things. We're obviously very Ethereum aligned in very deep ways, but I think
Yeah.
it's worth pressing the point that the reason we have not seen more product market fit, the reason we have to explain why we're so excited about blockchains is because of a lack of privacy. It's not
Yeah,
scale, it's not DevX, it's not UX, it's none of that. It is literally just because you cannot represent the kinds of transactions, the kind of actions, the kind of commerce, the kind of life that you want to represent on these systems without privacy.
yeah, exactly. So we could rather say it solved the reconciliation problem because everyone just has the same copy of the ledger, but no one wants it to be public, right?
Yeah.
And so Aztec is the exact complementary piece. If we look at current product market fit or real world applications, one thing in TradFi is that roughly 50% of the equity trading volume happens off exchange, either via OTC desks or dark pools, private networks, and whatnot. So this obviously could be a real world use case now with Aztec going live. What else are you seeing happening this year on the network, or where do you see the biggest potential for Aztec?
Yeah, I always say to people that people have this expectation, I think, set by the last maybe decade of talking to crypto people. When they ask about use case for technology that's being built, they expect these really archaic, really weird niche use cases. And that's because again and again, we've been in this situation where we've had the right idea, we've had the right ambition, but we've just been hampered by the fact that no one, again, wants everything to be transparent all the time. So I am excited about the same things that got me excited when I first encountered Ethereum. All of the ideas I want to see on Aztec are ideas that are in the Ethereum 2014 white paper. It is digitally native organizations, it is cash flows that go through these digitally native organizations, it's payments, it's assets that are on this global ledger instead of being within jurisdictions that have less meaning. I often say that what Ethereum is in my mind is a replacement for Delaware. It is a place where you set up your company, where you park your assets because you trust that the ledger on which those assets are, where your company is going to be a good safeguard, a good environment for your assets, for your company, that the institutions around them are good and positive. The first jurisdiction to be adapted to the post-internet world, right? Instead of these physical jurisdictions that have, again, less and less meaning. But really, practically, I guess taking it from there, right? The teams in the ecosystem that I find most exciting are doing things like payments, like connecting up to TradFi payments, because you can do really cool stuff with zero-knowledge proofs to tie fiat payment rails with blockchain payment rails. They're doing things for digitally native institutions like foundations or companies that pay with stablecoins, giving them the ability to natively have access to privacy because we're so connected up to Ethereum and to the layer 2 ecosystem through Wormhole and Substance and Train, which are all bridges. You can live, your assets can live on Ethereum, for example, but you still benefit from Aztec in one click, being able to send payroll, for example, through Aztec, getting a layer of privacy no matter where you are. So we have companies doing that. We have companies that have this pretty deep ambition of creating markets that are DeFi markets that add this layer of privacy for DeFi markets, both AMM style things, but also prediction markets, where you have like public for the results of the trades or public for like variables that matter to the whole market, but private execution in some deep way, right? So you're not doxxed like we've seen on Hyperliquid or others. Every time you do any single action, people can't copy trade in as easy of a way, but you still get the social benefit from these markets in the price or in the end results. And then we also have, I mean, Wolfgang, you mentioned ZK Passport. We have people who want to build really good crypto wallets, like payment wallets, that are maybe a few steps closer to being a true neobank, right? If you add the concept of identity, if you, as the wallet, know anything about your customers, but you can set rules so that your customers are less likely to fall prey to abuse or less likely to be bots or less likely to be a botnet farm in North Korea trying to money launder by creating a bunch of fake accounts all at once. If you as a wallet can have identity as a core primitive, you suddenly can step into business models that are appealing to neobanks, right? You can do under collateralized lending and you can do insurance and you can do all these kinds of things that I think will be very beneficial in the long term. But the overarching theme is these are not use cases that should be hard to think about. The only reason that these use cases that I'm still excited about 10 years in haven't happened is because privacy has been this fundamental blocker. And we've told these bad stories to ourselves in the industry that it's about scale, it's about DevX, it's about UX, but that's just never been true. It's just because most people don't want this like enforced transparency that Ethereum has.
Nice. You mentioned CK Passport. I think it's not talked about enough, because what I really like about ZK Passport, and if we make a segue on how you guys launched your token, you decided to not do an airdrop, instead doing a public sale via the new mechanism provided by Uniswap. You had over 16,000 individual participants, and we know that it wasn't individual addresses, but individual participants, because you provided the ability to do ZK Passport as your KYC. And this is, I think, one of the most fascinating applications, in my opinion, that you were able to do full decentralized on-chain capital formation.
Mm.
And it actually were 16,000 individuals instead of just addresses. Why did you decide to launch your token the way you did?
Mm.
Whose idea was it? Did that person get a raise?
Um, yeah, for context, we use something called the CCA, which is the continuous clearing auction that we built with Uniswap over the last year. The core idea is to maximize distribution, right? It's very difficult to play time games with these auction mechanisms. We raised over $60 million from more than 16,000 people. The realization we had in 2023 is like, no, we need to do this. We can't centralize and then trust ourselves to gradually decentralize. We actually need to launch decentralized. And we can't do something like build a system that only we can extend. We need to make it permissionless and programmable and easy to use for externals. If you go through all these hurdles to launch this product, it'd be a mistake to do the token distribution either in a way that we know is not effective, like an airdrop, especially with a decentralized sequencer set. We need the stake for the network to survive, to have economic weight. So we need people to purchase it, because otherwise I think we will attract the wrong kind of operator, unfortunately. We need people to have a real sense that if they don't do their jobs, it hurts, right? It's painful. But we also need the distribution to be wide so that from the get-go, it is no longer our network. We need people to have the same guarantees on Aztec as they have on Ethereum. We need them to feel like if it's going in the wrong direction, they have a say. They should be able to trust that we can't unilaterally be scared into stopping the network or reverting the network. They need to be able to trust that if they issue an asset on Aztec, it will be there forever. So we have these requirements. We want to do things right. We want to have wide distribution. We want to make sure that you don't fall prey to the same ICO. It's a very sophisticated market now. If you launch an ICO like in 2017, you have very sophisticated players that are going to come in, and they don't care about your objectives, right? They're just going to try to extract as much as they can. So CCA allowed us to really meet these objectives. It was an auction that lasted 5 days, and the core mechanism was you placed bids initially, your auction was filled, your bids were cleared over the course of the auction, and you always got the best price possible at any given time, which I think is just a really nice mechanism. Of course, if we had done that, but only allowed people to participate in some jurisdictions and only if they give us all their information, I feel like we would have betrayed a little bit what we're trying to do in this industry. And we have a team in the ecosystem that's been with us for a long time. ZK Passport has been building this tool to, on your phone, scan your identity documents. It can be identity cards or passports, as long as there's a chip that has some cryptography inside. And then without having to integrate with any government, without having to ask for permission, they can use that cryptography to generate zero-knowledge proofs and proofs of particular statements. So proof that I'm only from particular countries, proof that I'm not on a sanctions list, proof that I'm over a particular age, even proof, and this is, I think, incredibly cool. I always giggle whenever I experience it, proof that the photo in your passport is the same as the face staring at your phone, right? So it does a private face match. So you say we did zero knowledge KYC. It's more accurate to say we did zero knowledge sanctions check. We only sold tokens to people who could prove to us that they're not North Koreans or not on a widely accepted sanctions list. And if you could prove that to us, we don't know anything else about you. We don't know your name, your age, anything at all. That feels particularly important in the context of a public blockchain, right? Where you don't want everyone to have all information just because you participated in the sale about who you are and what you do and all these kinds of things. The people that had the idea of doing this, it's one of those things where it melds a little bit within good teams. Certainly my co-founder Joe, who's leading labs, and a bunch of the team had to push really hard to get this over the line. Andre and Amal on the legal side had to push really hard to make sure that we were doing everything right and we were not putting ourselves in jeopardy for pushing the boundary a little bit on and not collecting all this information that we don't think we needed to collect for people participating in the sale. It was a shared effort. Obviously, the ZK Passport team, we couldn't have done it on our own. It was a big lift from a bunch of people, but really worthwhile.
Nice.
Awesome. Before we wrap up, there is one last point we want to touch on. We talked about the sale, and I want to mention that sometimes there are projects in which the token maybe is not really needed, or there is some dissonance between token and equity. What is accruing value? How is the success of the project reflected in the token? First of all, can you remind the audience, what does the token do? Why do you need a token? What are the features, use cases? Let's introduce the audience to Aztec.
We were incredible skeptics of tokens for the longest time, and we wouldn't have done it if we didn't need one. And the reason we need one is because we chose to have a decentralized sequencer set from the get-go, right? If you have a decentralized sequencer set, you need a way to penalize bad behavior, incentivize good behavior, to reward the work that is done. And the protocol needed the ability to do minting and burning and slashing from day one. As a result, we need a native asset. And all fees that are paid when users use the network are paid in this native asset. Although we do have, for the end user, native fee abstraction, right? So to the end user, if they only have USDC in their wallet, they will be able to pay for transactions. What happens is eventually that USDC purchases Aztec tokens, and that is what pays the sequencer. Because we're decentralized from day one, we need a way to steer the network. You see a lot of governance tokens that are just, if you have some tokens, you can participate in a forum or something like that. Whereas this is really the stake that you have allows you to direct the network. It is in that way much closer to something like Ethereum, where the network is governed through hard forks.
Got it. Yeah, it's clear. The token is needed given this construction. I want to make it even more clear why you really need to be fully decentralized from day one. So the thing is, imagine that instead of a fully decentralized sequencer network that you need to provide incentives for, they will not work for free. Imagine that you had one centralized sequencer, one centralized prover ran by you, the Aztec Foundation. What is the worst that you could do in that configuration? I understand censorship resistance, clearly.
Sure.
You can just avoid including transactions from people that you don't like. But would the privacy aspect also fall in the case? I'm not sure about that.
Well, there's two ways to think about it. From a history perspective, we used to run previous products that we've shipped as centralized rollups, technically. L2s didn't have it wasn't a meme at the time, but it was definitely a server that we controlled that was aggregating transactions and posting them on Ethereum, centralized rollup. Even back then, the privacy for users was done on their computer. And so that centralized rollup didn't actually have privileged read access to any information. We didn't know what users were doing, which I think is very important. But it would be very easy for a centralized sequencer to say, let's say 15 years from now, Aztec launched as a centralized rollup. None of us original team are involved in the foundation anymore. New set of people that come in that are very risk averse, right? And they suddenly realize, crap, like we actually are taking huge risks by not knowing what people are doing on our infrastructure. Because at that point, if you're a centralized rollup, you control everything that's happening, right? It would be very easy for that team, that hypothetical team in 10 years or 20 years, to say, actually, you know what? Every time you submit a transaction, even though technically you're submitting a zero-knowledge proof, you're also going to be submitting the data in the clear, right? This is actually what folks like Maiden do in the early days. The sequencer, the kind of centralized operator of the network, sees everything that's happening as a safety mechanism. It feels nicer. Transitioning from that to actually we don't want to see anything anymore, I think is an impossibility. It's the same reason I'm skeptical of teams that are based, for example, that say they want to decentralize. I trust the team's intentions, but it is such a cash cow. It's so much more easy to operate a centralized network, to take on the lifts post hoc, right? To take on the lift after you already have something running. You have lawyers that are happy, you have compliance people that are happy to decentralize or to make your network private, permissionless, and all these kinds of things. In practice, I don't see that ever happening. Launching from day one, I think, is the only way that people can really trust that the network in 5 years is not going to rug them of their assumptions, right? The whatever privacy assumptions they have with the apps that they use on top of Aztec, the developers that build applications on Aztec, the only way those assumptions don't get changed from under their feet is if we actually give them the network from day one, right? And it is not infrastructure that we run. The foundation has no ability to control what's happening. We have a queue for people to join the validator set. That queue is a safety mechanism. If you flood the validator set, you have potential issues with abuse, with people buying stake and kind of stealing the network. And so we have this queue that's quite long, and it was particularly long after the sale. A bunch of people bought stake to join this validated queue. We realized post sale, actually, it's a bit too long, right? We'd actually quite like to increase the rate at which people get added to the validator set. That is a governance decision. That is not a decision that we could take unilaterally. And you guys know this because you're in the
Yeah,
chat where we asked you as
yeah.
validators, we begged you, pleaded, like, please make a decision as a sequencer to signal for this governance vote. And we had community pushback, right? People who rightly said, this decreases my earnings over the time period before TG, which I think is a valid concern. There's no part of me who resents them for voicing that. It's money that they maybe assumed would be better in their pocket rather than someone else's pocket. I'm enough of a capitalist to think that's a very legitimate concern. And we had to go around operators and talk to people in the forum, again, to make our case that for the long-term health of the network, we thought it was better if sequencers pushed for the queue rate to increase. So we're already at this point now where we're not at a point where we can unilaterally say, we decided that for the network, it's best to do this. We have to deal with the stakeholders that are helping us run this network. And I think that's the right way to go.
Awesome. Just one
I
quick
mean, it's also
question.
a proof that
Go
the
ahead.
design works as intended,
Yeah,
right?
indeed.
Yeah, I need to ask you this just to be sure. So the roll-up contracts can only be upgraded by governance. There is no security council at all, not even for freezing. Because there is this common thing that we need the security council because ZK proving is, we don't know if it's completely bug-free.
Yeah, it's quite
We need
complex. Yeah,
multiple proving systems and voting 2 out of 3 proving systems because what if there is a bug?
yeah,
Let's just use the security council. So what are you planning
yeah.
to?
Right now, the roll-up contracts are always immutable. There is a possibility to transition to a new roll-up contract. So this is a hard fork in essence. And then there's a decision that needs to be made when the new roll-up contract gets transitioned to. Do you copy the state of the old roll-up contract or start fresh? Starting fresh has costs for apps deployed, for users, and all these kinds of things. But in any case, we expect these kinds of hard forks to decrease over time. The whole point of the system is to stabilize over time. The roll-up contract is always immutable. You can hard fork into a new roll-up instance through governance. And for security councils, I'm a big fan of really scoped councils. We have something at the moment called the slashing veto council. They have very scoped powers. And when user transactions go live, we are expecting to have some kind of security council, but again, they won't have privileged governance ability for the network. They won't have even pausing ability.
Mhm.
They'll have a little bit of a flag, right? That apps or developers portals, for example, bridges from layer 1 to Aztec or bridges from layer 2s can listen to. So again, it's not something that we can do unilaterally. It's just how we think about this trade-off between safety and decentralization.
Awesome. What is your wish or personal goal for Aztec? At what point do you have a milestone or something in which you will consider Aztec successful, or at least a minimum that you want to? At what point you will feel like, yes, I have delivered, or we have delivered what we wanted?
It comes back to what we were talking about earlier about the product market fit of Ethereum and blockchains. We're very keen in this space to talk about the assets or the locked assets on these various DeFi protocols and stablecoins having however many trillions of volume over the past couple of years. To me, that is all cope. It all feels like cope to me. Like we set out to build a new jurisdiction, a replacement for money that is separated from the state. We set out to build financial infrastructure that was built for the post-internet world. we're kind of taking these prizes for losers essentially by saying like, oh, look at BlackRock that is issuing a hash of something that's on their database and talking about that as success. I just want a meaningful portion of economic activity of the world to be happening on blockchains, on Ethereum specifically. I consider Aztec an extension of Ethereum, really the thing that allows Ethereum to get the product market fit that it deserves. And I think will deserve to get the praise that we all throw on each other when we hit 30, maybe 40% of economic activity facilitated through these platforms. And that's going to take a while. That's going to be quite difficult to do. There's a bunch of things that we need to solve for still beyond what we've solved for already. But that to me is the goal.
Awesome. That will be happy. So yes, rooting for you and any project in this direction. Awesome.
Yeah, I also would like to give my last question. I think one could say you've done really well in terms of how you launched. I see the vision that privacy is a requirement. It's ambitious also how you state that it would be great to have 30% of economic activity running on these networks. You've raised more than 100 million now. How are you going to put that money to work?
We've always been very conservative with how we spend cash. I think we always treat it as when there was VCs investing, but same thing now that it's the public sale. When people give you money, you're signing up for something. I'm incredibly grateful for everyone along the way who has allowed us to be building what we're building and to be pursuing what we're pursuing. But it's a lot of responsibility in most ways. Just like we need to be very sensitive with how we spend the cash that we have, because objectively we still have lots to do. In practice, most of that money will, over a decade or more, eventually go to some form of paying for talent, right? Paying for team members, paying for cryptographers, paying for lawyers, paying for, yeah, just talent that we want within the foundation, within the ecosystem. We're not ones to be splurging out on luxuries. We just want to make sure that people who are working on this are able to do this for a living and are able to do this really seriously. The one thing that won't be a rounding error is likely going to be audits. We are spending millions of dollars on auditing what we've built, bug bounties, and just making sure that people can really trust this infrastructure. We're ultimately very bullish on Ethereum one way or another. Like we're building on top of Ethereum, so that's why raising an ETH makes sense. But yeah, it's worth saying it took us 8 months to raise our seed round. We know that money can become scarce. We are not we don't have this assumption of easy money. Like even of our Series B that was raised in end of 2022, a very, very healthy chunk of that Series B is still in the lab's bank account, right? We just didn't even get close to spending it all. Money is a means to an end, and we need to be very focused on the ends.
Speaking of the end, it was a pleasure to have you, Arnaud. Glad that we've been able to participate as a Genesis sequencer. Really appreciate you coming by. Thanks a lot to everyone. We hope you enjoyed, and until next time.
Thank you so much.